Welcome to this episode of Abide in Me, How Jesus Models Secure Attachment with God. This series is a survey of the Gospel of Mark, looking for how Jesus models what is now called secure attachment, which is the physiological, emotional, cognitive, and spiritual experience of what is often called salvation or regeneration or being conjoined with God or enlightenment, individuation, even becoming spiritual. Through the series, we will discover the benefits of becoming securely attached with God, which is the transformation of one's life into one of joy and satisfaction. And so we continue in the third chapter of the Gospel of Mark, beginning at verse 13, where Jesus finally gets away from the crowds by going up onto a mountain, and he calls some to go with him. And then he calls out of that smaller crowd 12 men, and he tells them that they have to go out and preach. And then Mark says he gives them the authority to cast out demons. We'll see how that works out later on. And then these 12 apostles now are named, and they're given descriptions. Some of them are even renamed, like Simon is renamed as Peter. So we're continuing to explore Jesus modeling secure attachment. And we see here that Jesus thinks it's important to create community, to establish connection amongst people becoming spiritually connected to each other, to be in relationship with each other as a foundation for their spiritual and natural lives and for the sake of the greater mission that Jesus is on. This is a new way of relating for these people. Before, it used to be you were Jewish, you were in the church, or you were not. And that's what brought you together or not. So Jesus, again, we're trying to see how he models becoming securely attached to people so that those people then can actually love each other. This particular story is about the qualities of a person who is able to connect to other people and the benefits of having and expressing those qualities. So early in this very concise Gospel of Mark, Jesus is preaching and healing and casting out demons in the synagogues. And then there's this death threat against him because the leaders of the synagogue see his power as a threat to their power, even though Jesus isn't trying to get their kind of power, right? So Jesus leaves the synagogue and never returns to preach in synagogues in the Gospel of Mark. And yet we are told crowds continued to follow him. Even from outside the country now, his fame is spreading. In calling out a group and naming them, Mark is asserting that Jesus is saying that Christianity is following him as a group in community. Jesus is building a network of people that is the core work. He says, I am starting with you 12. Your job is to go out with this message and do these things and build community. The message is that people can love each other, period. No considerations, internal or external, are to interfere with loving another person. And 2,000 years later, this is still a radical way of being and often difficult to live. And the really difficult expectation Jesus lays on these 12 men is that they should preach the good news, which he is teaching them, and then cast out demons. Look at this as the apostles symbolizing, representing all the different ideas and desires we can have in our minds and hearts concerning loving each other and God and ourselves. The first readers of Mark's gospel back in the day would notice, it would stand out to them that Jesus chose 12. It is a symbol of holiness and wholeness and completeness. So what set these men apart is that they had two qualities that fulfilled this symbolic image of wholeness and completeness. First, they were all attracted to Jesus, like we noticed before. They liked what he had to say. They enjoyed being with him, each in their own particular way. They were getting something out of it. And in that state, he was able to draw them to him. Secondly, they were brave enough to stay with him, as they did for 3 more years, through lots of threats and persecution. We know that a number of people in the story, we are told about people that come and they don't stay. They lack one or both of these qualities. I would note that later on, a number of women will stand out in the story for these very same qualities. Now, I cannot imagine living a day as these itinerant teachers and healers did. Maybe it was easier for them than I can imagine, but what is outstanding are these 2 qualities of following Jesus and being brave. These people modeled how to be with Jesus, how to stay with him and to do what he said to do, to believe what he said to believe. And he gave them a message to share and a power to share it. And that brought them together because they loved each other. They experienced loving each other because of this context that Jesus was creating, this whole new culture. We see modeled here the requirements for being in a community and the benefits of being in community. All the truth we can know and believe and all the love we can share describe the community we now call religion. Religio, in Latin, it means to be connected. It exists first inside of us, consisting of truths we believe and the goodness that we love. When a group have a religion together and they gather, it's called a church. This basic community called a church is what Jesus is talking about. It is that religion that exists inside of us, which Jesus calls the church, when a number of us gather together. Notice that this is far different from what the apostles knew the church to be. And I want to be clear here that this religion and church might not be what these words generally mean today. These ideas, these truths, this religion are the message, and the love, which the truth reveals and manifests in action, is the power behind or within or under the message. So there is the message, and the point of the message is to manifest love. Jesus gathered his apostles to spread the divine love that he was manifesting in the world. Now, if Jesus' goal was to be right, to be correct, to merely teach a code of behavior, then he would have stayed in the synagogue and continued to argue with the intelligentsia and convince them how he was right and they were wrong. But he stopped doing that early in his ministry, as if he had found a new way to be and to do. He didn't need to argue anymore. He didn't need to try to convince anybody of anything anymore. He discovered this spiritual goodness that he was embodying and manifesting. And that is what I'm suggesting is the model for us. Can we find that divine goodness within us that is from the source, from God, from the Creator, that we can then manifest through the ideas, the cognitions, the notions, the truths that we speak, and through our actions? Jesus was creating a new paradigm called the church that exists for the purpose of developing our humanity, for the purpose of loving the neighbor, and so coming to know how to love our Creator, and then experience that oneness that is a relationship with God and with other people. Now, the next significant thing in this little story is that Jesus renames 3 of the men. He gives them new names. I read a story by a man who was talking about this experience. He begins by saying that when his mother and father announced that his name would be John, all his relatives were delighted because it was a familiar family name, and so they were continuing the tradition. However, his story goes, his great-grandfather lived in Ireland, and when his parents named him John, right, 2 generations before, everybody was upset. They were astounded because they expected him to be named Sean, which in fact is the Irish equivalent of John. But the parents did not follow the tradition, and all the relatives said there was something wrong. But the story goes The parents were obviously introducing a new idea, a new culture. They were looking forward to their son being part of this new culture. Perhaps they were anticipating him going to the United States as he did. And then the author goes on to say, and if I have a son, I'm going to name him Juan, which is the Spanish equivalent to John. He says, people around me will be very upset. They will wonder, what are you doing? Why would you do that? If the name was changed, it would be because he wanted to introduce this new culture. He wanted to change things for a specific reason, on purpose. So the story Jesus renaming some of the men models how we can create new circumstances in our life, begin a new story that open us up to new or healthier relationships. Perhaps we can use the more modern language of reframing, right? We need to reframe our perceptions of life. There are wonderful applications of this idea of reframing or renaming. When someone gets angry at me, I can rename that. I can reframe it as that person is afraid of something, which is really very likely to be true, because we know that underneath anger is some drive, some emotion like fear. Or when I look at someone and immediately come to some judgment about them, maybe I'm thinking from past experience I had that might have been bad, or an assumption or a bias that I just normally hold, I can rename that. And I can say, wait a minute, that person actually enhances my life. That person has something to offer me. See, I've reframed it. I've changed the inner circumstances. I've renamed it. Jesus is modeling a way of being that is a spiritual, secure relationship with myself and my Creator that allows me to see all other people as related to me, as in a relational way. I'm not simply seeing myself individually, but I'm seeing myself as interdependent, not codependent, but in relationship with others. That's the new way of living that I would discover by practicing this renaming or reframing. The community that Jesus was creating could not have happened in the social, political, and cultural environment and the structure that existed at the time. That is why he literally called out from the crowd, these men who were the 12. This models for us how we are to go to the effort to come to a complete picture of ourselves, to identify all of our emotions, all of our desires, all our needs, all the wants that we have that describe our humanness. All is welcome there. And we take the time to reflect and notice them and cultivate those that we want to manifest in the world that we judge to be good qualities for all then to see, to bring us into relationship with other people. That's the task of Christianity or our religion, whatever its roots and tradition. It is both an inner examination and reflection and observation, and then an outer action. It is our life's work, and it cannot be done as an isolated practice, because at the same time, Jesus is saying this is a community effort. That's why there are 12 of you, and of course then that multiplies greatly, very quickly. This effort could not have happened in the synagogue, right? This can't happen in the structures that have produced the woundedness and the stories and the presumptions and assumptions and biases that we have. Jesus encourages us, therefore, to take, as it were, an outsider's view of our life, to go out of that comfortable, safe place, to look honestly and objectively at ourselves. And it will be scary to discover and to name our perceptions, to put aside our assumptions, to rename or reframe some of them, and to recognize that perhaps we are projecting these stories and these attitudes. We're making stuff up, right? At the same time, as Jesus is describing it here in the story, we are under a certain pressure to find others, to create a community based on this model of love for yourself and for others and for God. That is why I believe, we are wired with this desire to be connected, to have a secure attachment, to be bonded with others, because it creates a healthier world in me and around me that reflects this ability we have to connect and to love other people as the foundational reason for our living. So, as I'm sure you've all experienced, we try, right? We try to be nice. We try to connect. We try to be honest. We try to be transparent. We try to be vulnerable. And often we fail. Sometimes we get wounded by the effort. Sometimes we wound others in our efforts. So there is pain, there is suffering in this effort to reconnect to others. Not because we're evil, not because the other person is evil, but because there exists for all of us this self-centered, self-absorbed, and fearful ego, which causes disruption. It interferes. It gets in the way. It's not the right structure, culture to support this new way of living. So Jesus is modeling, trying again and again to build community by loving others. When we do this, because we are human, because we are engaged in the work that our Creator, our humanity, or the energy of life has set before us, even as the apostles did, the work that Jesus gave them to do, we are then on the way. And through it, I note, we learn how to connect with others. While we are frail and fragile and prone to error, we have a message which we didn't make up, which has been given to us, which is true gold, which is the healthy spiritual connection of love for each other. And we have a power which we didn't originate, which we didn't make up, which is there for us to use, which is the very goodness of the divine love. So our task is to keep looking for how truth and goodness, message and power are connected. We need to look for those names, those qualities. And sometimes we have to be willing to change that quality, rename it. But by means of that ongoing effort, over time, we will pass through suffering, we'll go through ordeal, we will experience the deep connection that the Gospel of Mark has described as having to happen. A transformation into a person with an ever greater capacity to love. I pray this has supported your transformative life, whatever practice you have in your life. I want to thank Solomon Keel for his music, and I want to invite you to make a contribution to this work if you wish and are able through the PayPal link. And I invite you to continue to listen to the next episode. You be well.